Parsons got me on the moon. Jack Parsons got me on the moon.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Velocity of Now with me, Thomas Sheridan. It is the end of March 2024. It's Easter weekend, so you'll be listening to this on Easter Sunday. So if you're a Christian, have happy Easter. If you're a pagan, Ostara blessings. If you're I guess Jewish people have their Passover now, don't they? And there's other festivals as well down these times. So I quite like this time of year. I quite like Easter, actually. Even though it's a Christian festival, I do like the kind of way that paganism has greatly entered into it. It's been so well, brought into it. The eggs and the bunny rabbits and all this stuff, and the traditional Christians are going absolutely psychotic, and that's on the misunderstanding. I saw a post the other day where they had posted a photograph of the Artemis, the famous Greek Artemis, she looks like eggs or breasts all around her. It's a very famous statue. It's generally considered now that that's not her breast or eggs. It's objects external to her. They're like in front of her, and they're not actually connected to her body. It's just the way the sculpture is done, and many people now believe they're beehives, and I think I go along with that. And that makes perfect sense, because this would be the time of year in Greece that the beehives and the honey processing season begins. So anyway, they claimed that the festival of Easter comes from Ishtar, the Babylonian goddess. It's completely and totally wrong. You see this non-stop on the Neopagan sites. You see it on truther sites who are all, Christian truther, psychotic sites. You see it on everywhere. And it's still going on. No, Easter comes from Ostara, which is the Indo-European pagan festival of the spring and regeneration and fertility, expressed in the Germanic form as Ostara, the goddess of the spring. And that's where it comes from. It doesn't come from Ishtar. That's a completely different thing. Now, the other day, a monumental NPC muppet of almost incomprehensible magnitude, one of these guys who's like middle-aged and is still his mammy's boy, thinks he's really smart. And I just said quite casually on an Irish megalithic group, Ostara greetings, everyone. And he posted a link to Ostara magazine, which was a neo-pagan armament magazine, newsletter, pamphlet that was published in Germany, actually Austria, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Guido van List and these people were very central to it. And it's apparently this notorious document, this notorious magazine that inspired Adolf Hitler. It's an esoteric pagan revival magazine. And yes, Hitler was a fan. In fact, he went out to the castle where it was published to get issues that he hadn't got in his collection. And he posted it to imply that anyone who believes in Ostara is somehow a neo-Nazi. Like an automatic impulse to this creature. And so, and then he says, "Oh, but God bless you for your ignorance. You probably don't know." And I just posted a link to my book, Valpurgis Night, and it says, well, you can check out my ignorance here. But I've actually read several issues of Ostara, translated into English for me, because there's no PDFs I could ever find, not back then anyway. And I did not find any articles that really talked about, subhuman races. This is what you're always led to believe. It does talk about how racial codes are kept in the DNA. I completely agree with that. So do Jews, so do many other races, Chinese, Asians, and that's okay. And that there are certain attributes inherent within the cultures, but they're kept inside this DNA. Yeah, that's true. It's a problem. It's there, and some of the articles are very interesting. They talk about things like electronic gods, the creation of a kind of a god that can be brought into manifestation through electricity and things like this. And most of the other things are just like information on various festivals and rites to do with Germanic culture. And also a kind of a tribute to Germanic ethnic groups that were but isolated outside Germany, way into Russia, way into Romania, into Hungary, and really deep into Asia, Eurasia, like nearly almost like Kazakhstan almost. There were German communities. So that's basically what it was. So he posted that thinking he could make out that anyone who's a pagan was somehow automatically a Nazi. And you get that a lot with the NPCs now on the left and the woke types. And just ignore them when they try to do that. And you also have this kind of weird counterbalance where on Neopaganism in Ireland, they all think they have to be mad lefties, mad wokies, to escape that tag. My attitude is, I don't care what you think of me, and none of us should either. But we live in a world where it's easier to have a deliberate misunderstanding and use that ignorance to attack others. See, there's NPCs in paganism, and there's NPCs in megalithic research, and there's NPCs in everything. And they're all the same. They immediately because you take the conversation outside the demarcation zones which they are comfortable or want, you will immediately be dehumanized and, misjudged and basically, slagged off, slandered, misappropriated, in order to try and get you to bring back your conversational elements back into the tiny little bandwidth which they operate in. And you see it in so many other things, Like I was thinking the other day, I saw some guy going on about the Freemasons worship Baphomet, which is true in some lodges. That's absolutely true. And Baphomet is the devil. And that's because they see this thing and it looks like a devil, and it was used on the cover and in the movie The Devil Rides Out by Dennis Wheatley. The Baphomet of Mendes, the satanic goat of the witch's Sabbath. And it was drawn by Levi in the 19th century. A very good illustration too. And they think they see the devil, But the Baphomet story is actually a bit more interesting and a bit more, unusual. It goes back to 1307, when Philip IV of France we all know he accused the Order of the Knights Templar of heresy and homosexuality. Now, the accusations may or may not be true. Probably not, because the Philip IV's greed for the orders, for the Knights Templars order, and their colossal banking wealth and land ownership, and the fact that the Knights' confessions were all extorted through extreme torture and threats, has made, even right back to then, made historians very suspicious if this was true, that the Templars were falsely accused. But one of the prime accusations made against the Templars was they worshipped an idol which they named Baphomet. Now, this was a head, sometimes said to be a human skull, and sometimes a stuffed human head, sometimes a head with 3 faces. And the knights were accused of believing that the head was the source of their riches, and also the source of fertility. It made the tree blossoms and the earths produce crops. Now, the first thing I thought when I looked at the classic images of Baphomet and read that about the nature elements of it, the first thing I thought, well, it was a pan cult, a panistic cult. And the Templars, if they were worshipping this deity, well, it almost certainly was pan worship. Now, that would have definitely got them done for heresy. Now, there were supposed to be several of these heads of Baphomet kept at different Templar locations. One was described as being made of metal and having a human-like face with curly black hair. Now, we all know that cults of the head, in terms of it being the centre of life and fertility, is very common in Celtic, what's like Celtic culture? We'll say the Gauls of France, Belgium, and into northern Italy, and that they had the cult of the head. They believed that the head was the seat of the soul. Everything was in there. And very few Templars actually confessed to worshipping the head as part of this head cult. There were 231 knights examined by the Pope's commissioners, and this was before it wasn't actually, it was after the Inquisition. So the Pope's commissioners, only 12 of the 231, only 12 of them, a dozen, admitted to knowing anything about the head cult, and 183 confessed that they had renounced Christ, and 180 who confessed to defiling the cross in various ways. Again, all done under torture. But renouncing Christ could just be, it could just be becoming a pagan again. Not saying that you have a hatred of Christ, you just become a pagan. This is like what they got the Cathars from. In the book that I wrote, myself and Neil MacDonald and Virginie Saunier, The Priest Wizard of Rennes-le-Château, we started off by talking about a village that we both started our adventure in, our theory in, Alley-le-Bain in the Cathar country, which was once home to Nostradamus and a very major centre of the alchemy, the Kabbalah, and basically the esoteric world of the whole time was centred around the small area in France. There were heresy trials that took place in the latter days when they were like basically having a mopping up operations of the Templars. And one of the interrogations that took place in Alley-le-Bain, a young student said that the vast majority of students, even Catholic ones, well, Christian ones, said that they believed the transubstantiation, the transformation of the soul, or the embodiment of Jesus Christ into bread and wine, was not only absurd, but heretical in itself and also impossible. It was a form of magic, and it was contradictory to the ethos of Christianity. And this was also considered denying Christ. No, it wasn't. These students in Paris and in Toulouse were still Christians. They still venerated Jesus Christ as their Saviour. They just said that the actual transubstantiation of the Catholic Mass was absolute nonsense. but that was also part of denying Christ as far as the orthodoxy was concerned. Now, the actual name Baphomet itself is a real, mystery. It is usually explained as a corruption of Monomyth, which was spelled Baphomet in Provence, which was the centre of the Cathar heresy, which I just spoke about, and which some authorities believe the knights were infected. See, the Knights Templars wanted to turn the Cathar lands around Rennes-le-Chateau that were formerly Visigoth lands into their own private kingdom. But there was always a belief that the Knights Templars had a secret association, admiration, alliance with the Cathars. It would have been very bad if, say, the Knights Templars, this enormous standing, powerful army, had sided with the Cathars against the papacy. We'd be living in a completely different Europe today. Now, Montague Summers, what he said is alternative issue to it. Even though he's, controversial historian of witchcraft and Satanism, suggested that the name was a combination of two Greek words, bathe and metis, meaning absorption into wisdom. The wisdom being the knowledge of the God who had really created the world and man, and whom Christ was an evil enemy. Now, in France in the 19th century, Levi drew that famous picture of Baphomet that we all know, that the three of us go mad about. Thank. And in this book, The Doctrine of Ritual High Magic, he called the Sabbatic goat the Baphomet of Mendes, combining in one image the idol of the Templars, the tarot card called the Devil, and the Satan of the witches, Sabbath, who appeared as a goat, and the divine he-goat worshipped in classical times at Mendes in Egypt, and is said to copulate with its female devotees, as the devil did with witches. Now we're back to the Pan thing again. You see, this is how dangerous it was to, even when, the 19th century, you could have no problem talking about any kind of wild esoteric Satanism and putting it into your books. But as soon as you spoke about paganism, like you brought up Pan, you were in deep shit. Now, Levi called the drawing a pantheistic and magical figure of the Absolute, a diagram of the God who is the sum total of everything in the universe. The figure contains symbols of the four elements, so you have the head standing for fire, the wings standing for air, the scales for water, and the legs for earth. Now, the torch that's burning at the top of his head is a symbol of divine revelation, and we see that a lot in Freemasonry. The pentagram is of human intelligence, that's on his forehead, and that would be the seal of Solomon. Now, the pentagram really is a Jewish Kabbalistic symbol, and although it's been incorporated into Neopaganism like Wicca, I'm not saying it doesn't belong, but it's not, I know a lot of Wiccans and Neopagans just somehow thinks it comes from European magic. It doesn't. It comes from the Middle East. So the figure contains a symbol of the five elements, as I said, and the pentagram of the human intelligence. There is a white and black crescent of the moons of being good and evil, so like you have that, and the union of the sexes, the breasts and the hands of maternity and toil, and two of the penalties for the sin of Adam and Eve, but also, according to Levi, the signs of redemption. So, I mean, that's what the Baphomet, goat of Mendes really is. It's an encapsulation of all Western esoteric beliefs, from sort of like Kabbalistic through Christian, with very little hints to the obvious paganism which is there, and even has the cloven hoofs of Pan. But it just goes to show you could talk and write about everything in the esoteric, but you couldn't bring up paganism. Now, what does that really, really tell you? Now, in the last show, I spoke about the upcoming eclipse on April 8 in the US, Canada, and, well, basically from the Pacific to the Atlantic. and it's very interesting path that it takes. And I went looking. I saw like I don't know who it was, but a guy was saying online that the Mayans could predict when eclipses were coming, and they could then use it to fool people. And so saying like, you have angered the sun god, that's why it's gone black. Do something right now for the rich, and the sun will return, and that would make it look like they had appeased the sun god. I often wonder how much truth is that. So I started digging around into just the general sort of esoteric nature of eclipses, and it really is so deeply ingrained into humanity, into us as people. You know, humans have always regarded the sun with a sense of awe and reverence, and not surprising too, because not only because it's seen as the energy source of all life, which it is, and also because of its inflexible reliability and the cycle of day and night and the seasons. The cycle is built into the evolutionary pattern of just about everything living thing on this planet, and so that they respond in one way or another to the sunset or the sunrise, as if they're almost remotely controlled or wired by the sun to do this. And sunsets and the dawn, sundown, become the natural, regulators of life and human activity. Well, they did in the past anyway. And rest periods. So it's not at all, surprising that the sun should be treated with this kind of level, this almost godlike respect, and in many cultures and pagan times worshipped, because of the security of the reliability again, and that it brings to us and brings to our lives and brings to the natural order of things. The cycle and the movement of the sun across the sky. And we definitely have a sensitivity to the sun in terms that we notice things with it. Like, for instance, anyone who was around during the 80s like I was will tell you that the sun back then had a completely different colour than the sun does now. The sun back then was a yellow colour. Now it's kind of a cold blue colour. And when I first started learning how to paint watercolours, it was, you painted the colour of a shadow as reflected, as, masked light. So the shadow of watercolours back in the 80s and 90s, but mainly in the 80s, was purple. You mixed red and blue together to create the effect of, say, a shadow on a white wall. Say you were doing a house, and the gable was the front was in full sun, and the gable was in shadow, and you would paint the shadow in purple. And now you paint it in blue, because the actual colour, when you start looking at it, you look at a shadow and you think, well, it looks like grey. No, when you start looking long enough, you'll start to see colours. Now you see blue. You don't see purple anymore. So that definitely suggests a change in sunlight. And some people will tell you, oh, it's because of emulsion films on 35mm film. No, it wasn't. It didn't pick it up that way. That's how it was. You have to look at the art alone to prove it. And it was yellow. It was yellow, and sunsets were more red, and lasted. The red in the sky lasted longer. Now, whether this is a case of particulates in the atmosphere, either man-made or as accidental as a result of air travel, or even things like volcanoes, I don't know about that, because during periods like, the Gothic period was founded in the year without a summer, when massive volcanoes basically greyed out the sky. But when the sun returned and massive sunsets appeared, it produced an explosion in watercolour painters, and we were not most famous of all, William Turner. You look at every single William Turner painting from after the volcanoes, and the skies are painted yellow. Even the daytime sky, there's a load of yellow in it because the sun is yellow. And then you go online now and look at William Turner watercolors, and the amount of yellow he used, the amount of Indian yellow he used to paint the sun in late afternoon or early morning. So the sun was still yellow. So I think it's actually happening in the sun itself. Now, back to the solar eclipses. In times when they were not understood, the phenomena genuinely did, not surprisingly, caused enormous fear and alarm among people. And, just claiming that a god or some gods were responsible, or some kind of dark forces or magic made the sun go out. Now, not only do you have the physical, almost traumatic event of you're working out in the middle of the fields one day, and suddenly everything goes black. Well, and that the visual aspects and that weird kind of twilight, black nighttime that you get when an eclipse happens. I've never been, like I said last week, under a full eclipse, but I've seen I think an 80% one, and it was the light, or 80 or 90%, and the light was weird. And then you have the cold. It suddenly gets very cold. This would have terrified these people, understandably. And we know, the total solar eclipse, which I've never seen, and I'm really jealous of you people in America and Canada going to see it. Could you imagine what that was like back then, considering what it's like now? The Romans even considered an eclipse blasphemous and held to be a legal offence to speak openly of their being due to natural causes. So in early Christianity, if you were to suggest that the eclipse was a natural event, it was considered blasphemous. This is the early Christian church. I don't know what it was like with the pagans. Probably would have been very similar. I don't know. Now, you have the gradual weakening of the sunlight as the moon moves across the disk of the sun, even though the sky remains clear and blue, and just before the eclipse reaches its total level, that the whole theatre, the whole drama of it all, the shadow can be seen bearing down at a speed of about 2,000 miles an hour, and the air becomes as unusually still. There's a stillness there, and then the darkness sweeps down, and there's an involuntary, temptation to crouch and let the shadow pass. And a glance at the sun reveals the prominences, the corona, and this is what also makes this thing. Corona loses its shine on April 9 after it's happened on April 8. We spoke about that last week, and it's just an incredible spectacle, just that by itself, until the sun reappears, and dawn is repeated in the space of a few minutes, seconds actually, and the whole world seems to come suddenly to life again. And in ancient times, that would have created an enormous sense of relief. The earliest recorded eclipse that we know of happened on the 22nd of October, 2136 BC, and it was referred to by the ancient Chinese in their Chowking Book of History. Now, of course, eclipses were seen earlier at different times than this, but that's the first one that was actually taken by official astronomers, and within the Chinese Chowking, it was taken by surprise. So it probably had been a long, long time since that part of China, maybe before living memory, because these things are so kind of can be sometimes some of these eclipses can be really long periods that no one hadn't seen it. Now, there was a ritual that went along with this when it appeared, and this was to bang drums and gongs, shoot arrows in the air, and make a general incredible noise, howling, with the intention of frightening away or scaring away the monster threatened to eat the sun eater. Now, the sun recovered from the attack. The two astronomers were executed for their negligence because they did not successfully predict that there was going to be an eclipse, and therefore so it's obviously the Chinese knew that eclipses were secular at that point, and these two astronomers, their inability within the Chongqing to predict this caused unnecessary terror and fear in China and social disorder, and they suffered the ultimate penalty. And that's not unusual, these rites to ward off the sun eater. There was a letter that was written in the Philadelphia Inquirer about an eclipse that happened on the 29th of July 1878, and the letter went, "It was the grandest sight I ever beheld, but it frightened the Indians badly. Some of them threw themselves upon their knees and invoked the divine blessing. Others flung themselves flat on the ground, face downwards. Others cried and yelled in frantic excitement and terror. Finally, one old fellow stepped up from the floor of his lodge, pistol in hand, and fixing his eyes on the darkened sun, mumbled a few unintelligible words, and raising his arm took direct aim at the luminary, firing off his pistol, and after throwing his arms around his head in a series of extraordinary gesticulations, retreated to his own quarters. As it happened, at the very instant was the conclusion of totality." The poor Indian guy was so scared he shot his revolver at the sun to try and kill the thing that was causing it. Now, solar eclipses are generally fairly short, and the total phase cannot last longer than 8 minutes, but the 8 minutes is a lot when you don't understand it. And the transient nature of the event that seems to promote the use of some sort of ritual. Now, no sooner have the demonstrations begun than the monster moves away and the eclipse is over. Such highly effective deterrents, they'll obviously be remembered and used again should the occasion arise. So you think, we chased the sun demon away, the sky demon away who was eating the sun by throwing arrows and throwing spears at it. And so they know for next time. And it gives them a sense of satisfaction and a sense of takes away the sense of powerlessness, that they can actually fight to get the sun back. And these days, we expect eclipse predictions to be very accurate to a fraction of a second because modern science and astronomy, cosmology understands the principles and have studied the motions of the Earth, the Moon, the Sun in tremendous detail. We have computers that can do this and everything. And even before, computers, they were doing with slide rules and other tables. Now, in that story, the Chinese eclipse, there is an interference that the astronomers should have known about in advance, and there was a good reason for believing that crude predictions were possible in those days because of the repetitive cycle of eclipses known as the Saros. Now, the Babylonians discovered that there was a Saros, or a cycle of 223 intervals between new moons, after which eclipses of the sun and the moon sometimes occur. If the eclipse is seen on a particular day, then it is certain that another will happen in 18 years, 10 days, and 7 3/4 hours, which is the sum total of 223 intervals between new moons. This is amazing how advanced the ancient peoples were, but will not have the same appearance. On average, there are 41 eclipses in the Saros cycle, and each one of these will be followed by another just over 18 years later. The Saros was almost certainly known to the Chinese of that period, and they would have, used it in predetermining the dates of eclipses. The first well-documented example of the Saros used in a successful prediction is an eclipse that happened on the 28th of May, 585 BC, by Thales of Miletus, who was a Greek scientist and statesman. But it was probably not him that developed that and was probably around for hundreds, if not thousands of years before he figured it out. Now, Christopher Columbus exploited eclipses and the ability to predict an eclipse in the hands of the astrologers, and their readings of the sky was variously correlated with natural disasters, deaths, wars, displeasures of the gods, and so on. Now, in more recent times, others have used the knowledge of the eclipse to great effect. Sir Arthur Helps, in his book on the life of Columbus, which he wrote in 1910, tells us a story of how the explorer Columbus used the lunar eclipse of the 2nd of April 1493 to obtain provisions from the inhabitants of Jamaica. Now, at first they were reluctant to help him, and he threatened them with divine vengeance. For that very night the light of the moon would fail. The natives were frightened, and during the eclipse they approached Columbus and implored his intercession, with the inevitable result that the moon was restored to them and provisions ceased to be a problem. He was a real bastard, Columbus. The only difference between lunar and solar eclipses as far as prediction and observations are concerned is that a total solar eclipse can be seen only from a narrow strip on the Earth's surface across which the moon's shadow sweeps during the time of the eclipse itself, and which may only be for about 150 miles wide. Very, very tight. Lunar eclipses can be seen from the entire moonward hemisphere of the Earth. So I've seen full lunar eclipses, maybe 2 or 3 of them at this point. Now, what you would expect that some detailed knowledge of the process causing eclipses would dispel some of the fears accompanying them, but the amazing that the evidence of modern anthropologists seems to refute this. It seems that the basic reaction to a major natural disturbance, particularly a solar eclipse, still contains an enormous amount of fear, with not just among native people, but within the general modern population. And you can see that already with the phobias and the Renfieldings that's going on among Christian truthers surrounding the upcoming April 8th eclipse in America. They're just, I can't believe they're going bonkers. And they're saying things like, I'm going to, hide indoors, get into my tornado bunker, and make sure I don't see the sun that day. And this is 2024, and you're still dealing with that. And I often think the reason why people are like this, that religion creates ignorance. But people don't understand the full meaning of myth and mythology and stories and parables, and they have been led to believe that things like the Bible are literal. They're literal truths, and they don't understand the subcontextual aspects of myth. Let's talk about myth for a bit, okay? Because one of my favorite subjects, I like to talk about. Now, the human importance of myth now and in the past is important because myth relates to acts of supernatural beings and the manifestation of their sacred powers. It becomes the exemplary model for all significant human activities. Now, that's the traditional view of myth, where in the post-Jungian, and I'm not saying that's wrong, that original sort of understanding of myth, but in the more modern post-Jungian Joseph Campbell element, they tell us things about the destiny of ourselves in terms of our own monomyth, not only as individuals but also as a people. The Greeks used the term mythos, which roughly translates as a fable or a speech or a tale, but finally came to note what cannot really exist. Now, the earliest philosophers had criticized and rejected Homeric myths as fictions and inventions in the 5th and 6th century. and they rejected the immortality of the gods as described by Homer. They especially criticized picturing the gods in human anthropomorphic forms. But if they were cattle and horses or lions had hands, or were able to draw with the hands and do the work that men can do, horses would draw in the forms of gods like horses, and cattle would draw them in the forms of cattle like themselves. And they would make their bodies such that they each had themselves reflected as their gods in their animal form. So though this ancient, and this goes back a long time, these critical analysis of Homer's mythology was seen, it's kind of like an effort to free the concept of divinity from anthropomorphic expressions of the poets and the artists. But even so, the mythology of Homer continues to interest the elite in all parts. Continued back then, in the Hellenistic world, but the myths were no longer taken literally. They were now sought as for their hidden meanings, and this was a very important period in the history of ancient Greece. Before this period, in the fifth and sixth centuries BC, the myths were seen as pseudo-historical. They may have been true, and they were taken literally. And then by at this period in the 5th and 6th century BC, or 6th and 5th is how you really should say it, there was a belief that these stories were ciphers of the personality. It was the beginning of kind of like psychology when you think about it. Like the Stoics, for example, they developed this allegorical interpretation of Homer's mythology and all religious stories. One example is the myth that says that Zeus bound his wife Hera, and the episode signifies that the ether is the limit of the air and so on. So they were, signifying that the demarcation lines within experiences of reality was expressed in the mythology of Homer bounding Hera. And when you first explain this stuff to people, I remember trying to explain this to a friend, he was a workmate years ago in New York, and he's a lovely guy and everything. He wasn't dumb or anything, but it was what came very obvious to me when I started to understand that myth are keys and lexicons to the dynamics of the human consciousness and the mysteries of the universe. He couldn't get it. Maybe he does now, but at the time he had great difficulty with it. Now there are other interpretations. It's called a euphemism. We all heard of euphemisms, and that comes from Euphemius, who was in the early 3rd century BC, and he tried to prove that the gods were ancient kings who had been deified. And this is not only to Greek classical mythology. This is also in Nordic as well. There are very interesting theories that Odin, or Wotan, was an old English king who became deified in a kind of a King Arthur kind of way. Then the myths represented the confusion of memory, and therefore you had imaginative transfigurations of their exploits of the primitive kings. So the history was lost, and these wild tales, and you could probably the Grail mysteries and the Arthurian and the Grail romances, that could be an example of that in the later period. So for the Stoics, myths were fictional stories full of falsehoods and full of absurdities to be rejected as abominations. So the Stoics were very black and white, very, very binary kind of thinking types. Now that may have served a purpose within ancient Greek at that point in either political or social sense, to address issues in society. And it's, and that's how it remained forever. And it was only in, say, the last 100 years, if even that, maybe the last 80 years, that Western scholars begin to discover that the primary and true meaning of myth was a scientific study. And it began in the 19th century with the likes of Andrew Lang and, of course, James Frazer, who you've often heard me talk about in Velocities of Nows over the years, the Golden Bell. And there was also a Max Muller, and in his mythology, he described it as a disease of language. I always thought it was very funny. But Andrew Lang, asserted that myths result from personification of natural forces or phenomena, a mental process that is characterized by the animistic stage of culture. Frazer of the Golden Bough regarded myths as mistaken explanations of human and natural phenomena. And at the beginning of the last century, you had Freud and Jung giving new impetus to the study of myths by pointing out the striking similarities between their contents and that of the world of the subconscious or the unconscious mind. And that's when I think it's almost like myth had waited for the development of psychology for it to become fertile. Now, this very new approach to myth is, indebted to the result of ethnology, the study of archaic societies, these societies in which mythology is, or until recently living, has revealed that myth for the primitive man means a true story, and beyond that, a story that is most precious treasure because it is sacred, exemplar, and significant. So therefore we have Homer's Odyssey to the Greeks. We have the story of Wotan to the Germanic people, and Finn Cuchulainn to the Irish people, to King Arthur to the Britons, Parzival to the Gallic, the French, and on and on and on and on. Now that was a new energy, a new charge that was given to the actual term of myth, and the word is now employed in both the modern and the old sense. So you think of it, it's been inherited from the Greeks as their concept of fiction and illusion. In terms of it, historians and theological scholars. And then there's also the sacred tradition, primordial, revelationary, and exemplary in terms of not codifying. The word I would use would be idealizing human behavior. In the case where we have access to still living tradition, a myth tells us how something came into being. That something may be the world, or a man, a tribe, a culture, an animal species, a social institution. So myth then is always an account of creation. It always carries it, and that's always been one of the things about the Irish mythology, is that there's no creation myth. But also remember, there are 900 books in Old Irish of untranslated books, documents, and books and manuscripts that are held by the Royal Irish Academy, mostly in London, that would probably within them may very likely have the Irish creation myth. They claim they can't, or they won't, or they want to, but they're not able to translate them because it would be very expensive and don't have the resources. I don't believe that one bit. I think there's stuff in those 900 Irish books that they don't want getting out. Whatever that is, they're trying to suppress the early history of this country and our people. So, the creation myth, that something came into being. Now, myth tells us only what really happened. The actors in myths are supernatural beings. They are known principally by what they did in the times of the beginnings. So myths disclose their creative activity and reveal their sacredness or their supernaturalness of their efforts and their works. And the intervention of the supernatural beings is that made the world what it is today. This myth is regarded as a sacred story of a people, and a true story, even if it's not history or not. It's a true archetypal story. Always remember that. Because the existence of the world is what made it true, and therefore proves it. So the myth on the origin of death is also the same, because man's mortality proves the mythology of death, the myth of death, sorry. So myth relates the acts of supernatural beings and the manifestation of their sacred powers. And because of this, it then becomes an exemplary model for all significant human activities. This is where we're coming into the monomyth with Joseph Campbell. So what happened in the beginning can be repeated by the power of ritual. And for this reason, it's essential for us to know and understand the myths themselves. And that's also another thing that makes me suspicious. The Irish cannot recreate their origin myth because we're told we don't have one. It may exist in the Royal Irish Academy's archive in London, and maybe certain elements have a vested interest in the Irish not knowing their origin myth, so we cannot recreate ourselves as a people. Now, it's pretty intense when you think about it, isn't it? So that's because by collecting the myths and reenacting them, people of archaic societies are able to repeat what the gods and the heroes and the ancestors did in the times of the beginning by doing it themselves, by saying this is where we began. And this is really what Tolkien was doing with his own mythological cycle, the Middle-earth cycle. He was trying to compensate for the creation mythology of the English people that had been destroyed with the Anglo-Saxon invasion and the harrying of the North. So one famous example I think Fraser gives is a certain tribe lived by fishing, because in mystical times a supernatural being taught their ancestors how to catch and cook fish. And the myth tells the story of the first fishing, and by doing so at once reveals a superhuman act and has shown men the way to perform it, to catch the fish, and finally explains why this particular tribe must procure their food in this way. And for the traditional society, myth is a matter of primitive importance. It concerns him directly in his existence on earth. His fishing in his fishing community was a gift from the gods, and so the act of catching fish is not only an arduous drudgery of labor, but it's a supernatural act in itself. Now imagine if we lived our lives in everything we did, we had that same. We're back to the monomyth again. Not what would Cuchulainn do, what would Wotan do, what would Valis do, what would Zoroaster do, what would not Buddha, but what would Arjuna do. And this external function of myth explains why a number of major themes are common to different mythologies. So you have cosmogenic myths. These are the ones that describe the creation of the universe and the creation of the world. Myths of origin they're found everywhere, sadly not in Ireland. In the Tolkien one, you have the others who sing the world into creation, and the disruptive inhibitive factor is Melkor, who sings a different song. I always thought that was a beautiful thing that Tolkien came up with. And the first humans were created by the Mother Earth, Father Sky, or a bisexual deity, very common in the earliest European ancestry of this sort of this bisexual male-female deity. or were fashioned from earth by a creator, or from food, bread, and things like that. And just about every mythical account of the origin of anything presupposes and continues this cosmology, the story of the world's creation, the creation of the world being a preeminent instance of creation, and the cosmology becomes the exemplary model for the creation of every kind. So you create in your life this with the same reverence that the gods created reality. And this is why you have the history of the dynasties in Tibet, and they rehearsing the birth of the cosmos from an egg. The Polynesian chants begin the same way. They talk about the egg, the universe being born from an egg. And this ritual, these chants are composed by the bards when the princess is pregnant in the tribe, and they are communicated to the dancers to be learned by heart as this is happening. The dancers, men and women, dance and recite the chant continuously until the princess gives birth to the child. It is this embryonic development of the future chief, were accompanied by a submission to the cosmology and the history of the world and the history of the tribe. He is being born only because he knows that the gods born the tribe to begin with. And the gestation of the chief is an occasion for a symbolic recreation of the world. Now, this renewal of the world through a symbolic repetition is found among many primitive and archaic societies. The Mesopotamians, the creation of the world was ritually, redone during the New Year festival, and a series of rites would be reenacted between Marduk and Tiamat, the dragon symbolizing the primordial ocean, the victory of the god and the world-creating labours. The poem of creation was recited in the temple, but the cosmology and the symbolically repeated chants and at other important critical moments were found in other cultures, in everywhere from Egypt to Micronesia, at the creation of a new king or a new tribal leader. Now there's the end of the world cosmologies. So you have myths of cosmic cataclysms are also very widespread. We know about Ragnarok and stuff like that. And they tell how the world was destroyed and mankind annihilated except for a single couple or a few survivors. And these myths implying, as they do, in clearer and darker fashion, the recreation of a new universe, expressed in an idea of progressive degradation of the cosmos, necessitating its periodical destruction and recreation. And that's what's happening with us today. Everything is nuts today because reality is dissolving and melting. And there's really only us and the tuas and the tribes who will get to the other side of this. So the myth at the end of the world is, it's very common in India, the Mesopotamian mythologies, Greece and Persia. Very, 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 very common. Even in the Judeo-Christian tradition, you have the end of the world, but it only occurs once, other than in the pagan tradition where it's secular. And the cosmos will reappear after a catastrophe will be the same cosmos that God created at the beginning of time. But this time it's purified, it's regenerated, and restored to its original pristine condition. The earthly paradise will not be destroyed again, but will have no end. So you're thinking of like the end of the yugas and the end of those cycles within the Vedas. Now it's just really important that this type of myth that illustrates the relevance and significance of mythology to us people today, to us humans. For the myth at the end of the world is at the centre of countless prophetic movements. And you have this thing called the oceanic cargo cults. And these movements announce that the world was about to be destroyed and that the tribe will regain a kind of paradise. The dead will rise again, and there will be neither death nor sickness, but the new creation, or this recovery of paradise. will be preceded by a series of cosmic catastrophes. Now the earth will shake, the rains will, fire will come down, the mountains will crumble, and they will fill the valleys, and the whites and the natives who have not joined the cult will be annihilated. And this was in 1923. The prophet Ronalvuro of the island in the New Hebrides predicted that a flood to be followed by the return of the dead cargo ships loaded with rice and other provisions. And in 1933, in the valley of Markham in New Guinea, a man named Mariafi declared that the return of the dead would be preceded by cosmic cataclysms, but the next day it would be found that the dead had already arrived loaded with gifts, and there would be no need for the people to ever again have to work or do labours. There will be a land of milk and honey and ambrosia. So this occurred in the Congo, and very interesting how these things all happened in the 20th century in these native cultures when they were coming under the stronger control of Western colonial powers. And that's a classic example. It's the Congo in 1960. Some villages, the inhabitants tore the roofs off their huts to give passage to the goal that their ancestors were to rain down from the sky. And everything was allowed to go to rack and ruin except the roads to the cemetery by which the ancestors would make their way to the village. Even the excesses had a meaning, and according to the myth, from the dawn of the New Age, all women will be held as common by all men. Monogamous, polymorphous, or whatever that word is, society, polygamous society, as they used to call it. Now, and that was very interesting how these indigenous cultures, as they became more under the control of Western powers, developed these myths where cargo cults, where the world will be destroyed, but doesn't matter. The next day, the ancestors are dead people, or someone will come with gold, food, and all this stuff. The land of milk and honey to be restored, and that's probably born out of a neuroses of becoming increasingly under the power of Western culture. Now, other examples of of mythology in modern man is extremely widespread, and that is of the hero. And this is the one we concern ourselves a lot with on the Velocity of Now. And he's immediately abandoned at birth because of a prophecy threatening danger to his father, who is a king or a powerful lord. The child is saved by animals or shepherds and is suckled by a female animal or a woman of humble means. When he becomes fully grown, he embarks on this extraordinary adventures. He kills monsters, he overcomes dead, he goes into the world of the dead and comes out, and so on. He meets temptresses, this kind of thing. He fights a dangerous animal, and it's very, very common. Then later on he finds out that he finds his parents and takes revenge on the father. My name is Sue, how do you do? That song by Johnny Cash. And is finally recognised and achieves the rank and homage. The dangers of the trials of the heroes, meeting monsters, demons, descending into the underworld and the rest, they all have an initiatory aspect to them. And by overcoming these deals, the young man proves that he has surpassed the human condition and henceforth belongs to a class of semi-divine human beings. Now, many epic legends and folk tales use and adapt these high dramatic scenarios. Robin Hood, Siegfried, King Arthur, and Luke Skywalker. Furthermore, the myth of the hero survives in the legends of many medieval kings as the reformer, the revolutionary, the repealer, this kind of thing. And this is one of the reasons I never trusted Daniel O'Connell, the Irish Catholic emancipator, who was a very well-schooled and adept, high-ranking Freemason. Even though he was a Catholic, he was head of the 33rd degree. He was the head of the Royal Irish Lodge, and he definitely set himself up as a kind of a earthly redeemer of the Catholics of Ireland. and played very cynically on this idea that he was the spiritual, entity that would liberate the Catholics of Ireland. He knew his shit. A boy that he knew his shit, and he played on it well. Now, in Western societies, one can see the nostalgia for heroes and heroic deeds. We have the Marvel comic and DC comics super people or superheroes. The detective novels, especially, a lot of them not so much nowadays, but the things like detective books and things like the shadow stories in the past, they were always about the battle of good and evil, between the hero, who was the detective, and the criminal, who is a modern incarnation of the demon. I know on the Velocity of Now over the years I've spoken about this notion of bull veneration and how we as Indo-European people, from the Celtic people of the western seaboards and Central Europe, to the Germanic people of Central Europe and Northern Europe, to the Norse people, to the Iberian people, to the Italic people, the Romans, the Greeks, all the way across Anatolia and into India, there is the concept of bull veneration. And this is one of the archetypes that's central to the restoration of what in Ireland we call the Tua, the tribe, but also all Europeans as a whole. It's also one of the reasons I believe that you have this concept that they want to slaughter all the cows. They blame global warming on cow farts. They want us no longer eating meat, because it's another version of when Moses destroyed the golden calf when he came down with the Ten Commandments. It's another attack on the Indo-European soul. Now, in Western society, within the concept of the bull, and the cow, but particularly we're going to talk about the bull in terms of bovine veneration, it's the production of beef. So for all of us, it's we rarely encounter bulls except in the butcher shop as food. But have you ever encountered a bull, a breeding bull, amongst a bunch of cows? The power and force of that animal is astounding. You cannot believe the charismatic energy, the magical power that the bull gives off when you're close to him. I remember a few years ago walking down a country lane, and a farmer was moving the cows from one field to another, and he says, "I have a bull with him. Just get on the other side of the gate there and just stand and just wait till I pass." And the ordinary cows walked by, and in the middle of them was this bull. My God. It was like something from Lord of the Rings to be that close to it, and the whole energy coming off it. So in modern world, we don't have that dramatic involvement with these ancestors in the same way, unless things that happened to me, coming to close contact by chance with bulls. Now, the story of human men and bulls began in the Paleolithic, what we call the Stone Age, and man was the hunter. And some of the most widespread and frequent hunted animals were various types of wild cattle. Now, the best known to ancient man in the Near East is now were a species that were called uruks or aurochs, and these were huge, dangerous animals with shaggy hair and long, curving horns. And this is where the Spanish cattle of today, the fighting cattle, the bulls of the matadors, are actually descendants of them. Now, of all the animals that our Paleolithic ancestors hunted, the aurochs were the most powerful and valuable because they had a plentiful source of meat, and their bones were used to make tools, things like harpoons and fish hooks, and their skin was made into clothing and even buildings, their hides. Now, wild cattle, just like domestic cattle, are still herding animals, and the aurochs herds consisted of a number of cows and calves dominated by a single fierce bull. Now, he would successfully, within the Paleolithic communities, those who would successfully hunt the aurochs had the first to kill this dangerous animal. And the ancient bull, like its modern descendants, were powerful, swift, extremely dangerous, and their horns were very sharp. So if you killed one of them, you'd earned your dinner. They were the most difficult animals of all to kill in Europe, and the ancient bull hunts in these Stone Age times were dangerous, bloody affairs in which members of both species would have been slaughtered and killed. But also the concept then drifted into magic and the creation of art. So the hunting of the auroch, the bull, was an integral part not only through the consumption of its flesh and the industry and the products from its body, but also the physical and psychic elements of the hunt became central to the development of Homo sapiens as a whole. And the emotions that were poured into them you can see in the cave art in southwest Europe, in particular in France and Spain. A lot of this was produced about 40,000 years ago, and it ran to for about some 25,000 years. Think about that. And in few exceptions, the art is animals. And most of the cave art in places like Lecaux in France or Altamira in Spain, the bulls and cows predominate. And archaeologists agree and art historians agree that for most part it was art for meat's sake. They had adduced two kinds of evidence, the art itself and its location. The art not only does it concern animals, but the same animals repeatedly, the bulls, the aurochs. And you would have the hunters with spears and darts and so on hunting them, and traps set down, and then you would have basically the slaughtering of them. Now this is called hunting magic, and these drawings were a sympathetic magical ritual based on the belief that the image of the animal in some way was connected to the real animal. So you draw images, or you meditate, or you chant, or you have rituals upon the image of the hunt being successful, and that makes the hunt more successful because magic works. The psychic forces generated by the magic ritual is transferred into this subatomic field, which makes it easier to achieve in real life, as the force of the magical intent loosens up the inhibitors within the dense quantum matrix. Now, the locations of the drawings also demonstrate the magical nature. In virtually every case, they are found not on the front of the cave or even on open rocks, but deep, deep, deep within the most subterranean caves, far from sunlight. So we have to assume that this artistic secretiveness was born out of not of modesty, but fear of discovery and retaliation by the very animals which the man sought to kill. At some level, they probably thought that this is the whole thing. Do you remember when I said that magic is a secretive art, and once you reveal your magical spell, it's over? Our very ancient Paleolithic ancestors did the same, and this would have happened in the barrows and the mounds. A lot of rock art you would find in places inside Irish mounds from the Neolithic, like Newgrange and Lough Crew, and now that'd be mostly magic. Now you have the concept that during Neolithic times, when they started to domesticate cattle, that a new dimension was added to man's relationship with the bull. And how this happened is not completely known, but it is a tremendous stride in terms of human culture. It took man away from the bondage of, specifically being only a hunter-culter. And it no longer had to be a slave to the arbitrary movements of wild herding animals, following them across the land. And now he could keep a ready supply of meat and later milk at hand at all times. And just the consumption of dairy was extremely important in the initial genesis of our Indo-European ancestors. They don't call them the sacred cows for nothing. Now, the most interesting aspect of the animal domestication, however, was that it appears to have been directly responsible for our ancestors first learning about sexual activity and regulation of sexual cycles concerning pregnancy. So they started to implement the first birth control by methods using cows in domestic situations. And then they would have probably understood that they could do the same themselves as people. Now, they had witnessed copulation among animals, for centuries, but there was very little evidence, funny enough, that man saw the sexual activity and the production of offspring as one is the same. And it was the same in humans. They were having sex all the time. The babies were like, it just happened. It wasn't until they started breeding cattle that they directly realized that the actual sexual act could be used to or not impregnate, depending on abstinence or promiscuity. So when the animals were being domesticated, this proximity and daily observation of them allowed them to perceive not only the cause and effect of procreation, but also other things. They started to become like zoologists. They started to understand the nature of the animals and see how it related to the nature of themselves. Now, but bulls were still seen as boundlessly strong and powerful, and they were esteemed for their sexual energy as well. And it was obvious that a single animal could impregnate an entire herd. Now, during the same time, and this is in the Neolithic, man also learned that the rudiments, the science of agriculture, and that seeds are sown would produce plants. But this was many years before the value of breaking the earth became known and before the plough was invented. For most in this period, cattle raising and agriculture were separate, elements of the agricultural activity. Cattle were for meat and milk, grain was for bread and, probably beer and things like that. Now, later in the Neolithic age, and this is the late Neolithic age, humans saw the relationship between his cattle and his crops, and they started to understand that there was great fertility that the bull could influence the successful growing of cereal crops. And a cattle raiser, he knew the tremendous fertilizing power of the bull, and from this, it was just a small step to believe that the fertility of the bull could be applied to the grain of a cereal crop, as it was for the fertility and the population growth of cattle. And the very first recorded hymns show that the praise is given to the great bull, the supreme bull which treads the holy pasturage, planting corn and making the fields luxuriant. And this is not a homage to the earth, to the seed, but the bull for his aid in walking around the plants and causing them to grow by emanating fertility. The plough also plays a part in this, as it's a kind of it impregnates the earth, and the pelvic bone of a bull would be put on the shear of the plough, and it cutting into the earth to fertilize it with seed was seen as an extension of the bull's virility. This is how our ancestors used mythology. See the power of mythology for dark and light understandings of the human consciousness and the state. That this symbolism of bull fertility led to the growth of agriculture and stability in food supplies. Now, the veneration of the bull really began with the civilizations in the Eurasian area, North Africa, the Indus rivers, the Tigris, the places that the first civilizations grew up in terms of achievement, that in terms of lasting infrastructure and so on. A lot of this had to do with the bull. It's one of the reasons that India was far ahead of the rest of the world. So in the hunting cultures, all able-bodied men hunted, but there was very little division of labor in or specialized tasks that was not involving the hunt. So when animal domestication and planting came along, man's efforts could field several other men. So it became a very productive system, and time and labor were released for other pursuits, the developments of cultures and things like that, building, understanding. So if you could produce storage of food and food storage methods, that gave you more time to work on things like science, art, music, poetry. And it's, and there's other people say, well, we also lost our freedom because we became slaves to the agricultural system. Well, it's just like, anything else. There's good and bad elements to it. It depends what you personally take from it. Now, during this period when agriculture was really becoming almost industrialized for the first time, the bull still continued to play a central role in human life as an imagined fertilizer of the fields, and archaeological artifacts and records of early civilizations in these areas, particularly the Indus Valley and down into India, repeatedly show the sacred bull. The analysis of these materials is surprising facts then emerge from this, and one is the central role of the central gods in the religion of these people being the bull god. And this happened in Ireland too. The Boyne Valley culture, Nowt Newgrange, that's Boan, the cow goddess, the bull goddess, and look how much Irish mythology, is it defined by Crete, how much of it revolves around the power and the necessity of bull veneration, so being a symbol of great strength and fertility. Now, the bull was also believed within Indo-European cultures to be responsible for thunderstorms, rain, floods, and even water in all its forms. And among the Egyptians, the bull god was actually linked with the sun and the moon, which you've seen from Egyptian art. In ancient Sumer, the bull god Enlil was worshipped as a god of the storm and supreme god of fertility. Well, that makes perfect sense. The rain falls, the crops grow, and connected to that. It was through his powers that there was water, and the fields were green, and all things grew. You see how interesting symbolism is? Just by the fertility of the bull and his association with agricultural proliferance is then generated a connection with rain and water. And this is how archetypes are manifested. All kinds. And mankind himself drew life and sustenance from him, the bull. Enlil, the god, Enlil, the bull god. And he was the exalted, overpowering ox, the lord of the world of life, powerful chief of the gods. And Sumerians in 3000 BC, that's how they did their invocations of the bull god. Now, in ancient India, the amount of evidence relating to bull-orientated or cow-bovine-orientated religion is astronomical. Now, the Aryans who were conquered the period about 1500 BC, they left this literary legacy concerning bull worship, and there are literally hundreds of hymns in the Vedas by these people that they became part of the Vedas by these people that were passed down orally from generation to generation and were written down and composed eventually made their ways into all the famous works like the Rig Veda. And the Aryans worshipped a number of bull gods, and like Rudra, Indra, and Agni, and many of they had certain symbolic powers relating to fire and so on, but they were bullish in nature. And just about every single hymn in the Rig Veda is in some way bull or bovine connected. Now, we know from ancient Egypt that it's just as intense, that these people worshipped a variety of bull gods, and there were two cults, the Apis and the Menevis, and were probably the oldest and widespread of all enduring Egyptian religious sects. The worship of the bull gods they're almost identical. Each were considered to be a god. Again, fertility and power, and each had a celestial aspect, not as common in Northern Europe because we don't have the constant sunny skies that you get in southern Europe and the Middle East. So they became celestialified, brought up into the stars. And again, they had elaborate connections with other gods, as if each other god derived some kind of initial sanctity charge from their association with the bull. Each god was believed to have an earthly manifestation of Apis, and being immaculately conceived by the impregnation of a special cow by a ray of moonlight. Now, isn't that very interesting? Isn't that very interesting? Upon the death of each divine bull, it was embalmed like a king and interred in a large tomb, which was known as a serapia. Now, this association between men and bulls go on through Mesopotamia, India, Egypt, and then relate to kings who refer to themselves as bull kings or bull rulers or bull emperors. And in Sumeria, the great Sargon himself was the tenant farmer of Enlil. And other kings acknowledged this and that they were appointed by Enlil. And so on, and the bulls of the horn were brought into battle and presented to captive kings in recognition of the bull god's sovereignty. There is a huge association between the king and god in Sumeria, and there's many interesting elements to it. Both god and king came to share the title the wild bull. Sargon was so called, and the seal of his servant shows a man watering a bull. Kings were, and then we had the connection between rain, bulls, power, life. Kings wore bull horn headdresses as a symbol of their divine appointment and power. And to make the connection complete, they brought about a custom of placing long beards upon the images of the bull god. And this practice was ritualistic in origin, but rooted in the idea and the common notion in Mesopotamia that the beard itself on a man was a sign of strength and, masculinity. And believe it or not, in Sumeria, only kings were allowed to grow the longest beards. Now, the relationship in Egypt is a bit different between the king and the bull, but it was actually in some ways more intense. So the kings would force that the king, when they united Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom around 3000 BC, Apis and spread the gospel of the bull throughout the entire land. So the bull Apis was done to unify the upper and lower kingdoms of Egypt as a common archetype which both sets of people could agree on. At the very early date of bull worship in Egypt became identified with king worship. Now, bull worship is characterized as a feature in the earliest civilization, and it also spread into other cultures throughout the Mediterranean, and it faced similar problems with holding values. And sooner or later, the focus and attention on the bull became central in the same way. Crete, we all know about that, and man's relationship to bulls are reflected both in the Near Eastern and their own central needs. So in Crete, for example, while the bull god was primarily connected with the sun and fertility, he was likewise linked with force, with the battle rage and the destructiveness of earthquakes, which were common to the island of Crete. And it also developed into public rituals, and the first bullfights and bull sports developed at that point. The bull within ancient Greece as a whole then became the focus of rites of sexual abandonment, which evolved directly into the Greek mystery plays. In Rome, and which was the rival of, and its foremost rival of Christianity for centuries, Mithraism, bull veneration, was introduced and became a way of washing away sins and purification of the body, while allowing the blood of a dying bull to purify a Roman soldier underneath it. Now, this is how Mithra is Jesus Christ. I know it's going to upset a lot of people on Easter Sunday when this is broadcast, or Easter Monday probably when it goes out. But Mithraism is Christianity. Mithraism, the washing away of sins, the blood, that's the transubstantiation of the Catholic Mass. And Mithra was born to a virgin on the same day as Jesus Christ, Christmas Day on Yule. And that Christianity came from Mithraism. It's as simple as that. The Christianity that we worship today, Catholicism and so on. Now, in the kings of Crete, and one called Minos, which were a kind of a dynasty, were supreme in both their spiritual and material lives of their subjects. And like the kings of Egypt, they saw themselves as the living human incarnation archetype of the bull god. And Minos stands at the centre of all Cretan legends and myths as natural leader of the bull cult. The king was the focus of activity during these celebrations, and stories of Minos, of the ceremonies and practices of the bull worship, spread all through the Mediterranean and became quite legendary and very inspiring to other cultures. Eventually, many of them became part of the same mythology from Greece that became central to that part of the northeastern Mediterranean. The Aegean, that part of the world. So the Greek island of Europa, and the bull in which the maiden Europa was seduced, is taken across the sea to Crete, by the god Zeus in the form of a bull. Now, have you ever seen anything in the European Union to associate Europe with Europa and bull veneration? This is why it is a false kingdom, a false empire. And when she arrived on Crete, Europa gave birth to Minos, who later became the bull god king of the island. And there's another early Greek myth referring to Minos, and when a tyrant ruled over Crete and who demanded tribute from Athens every 9 years in the form of 7 young men and 7 maidens. On arrival in Crete, these youths were taken into a giant maze and released. Here they became the prey of a ferocious man-bull, the Minotaur. Now, the Minotaur has played an enormous part in my own personal... I'll talk about this a bit deeper later in the show. I don't want to interrupt my train of thought here, but later on in the show, I'll talk more about the Minotaur and what it means to me in my work and my monomyth. Now, the Minotaur, roamed the confines of a maze in search of such human tribute, and the Minotaur was the result of a union between the wife of Minos and a bull which had become enamoured. By concealing herself within a wooden cow, constructed for her by the master craftsman Daedalus, she had seduced the bull. The man bull, she became like a kind of a dildo, it's weird, or what you call it, fleshlights for a bull. And so the man bull creature she bore was imprisoned by the king Minos of Crete in the labyrinth at Chronossos. And it was here that the young Athenians met their awful end. And it's the Minotaur at the hands of the Minotaur until one of their heroes entered the labyrinth and slew the beast. Again, I want to talk deeper about this, but I will wait till later in the show. Now, scholars have interpreted this myth with the aid of other myths and have concluded in their account that about these early bull practices that these included major groups of ritual, magical observances, fertility cults, dances, bullfights, sacrifices, and all kinds of other things like that. So the bull dancers of ancient Crete came out of this Minoan cult, and they have things like the running of bulls, which has entered into Spanish society today and Iberian society as a whole, and the wild bulls to their final death in the arena. And it appears of hundreds of Grecian vases and the art forms and everything. And the evidence we know for this is these were serious business. This was like the Olympics or the World Cup of Cretan society. And this was accomplished in the arena in 2 ways: by grappling horns and jumping over the bull, or by bull sacrifice. Now, the Cretans, like the ancient Sumerians, considered the horns of bull to be the focus, like wands, like 2 wands, antennae, and it was the essence of the bull's archetypal strength and energy. And the magical fertile horns of the bull became part of the religious life of these people. The initial part of Cretan bullfighting was composed of a series of ritual actions designed to procure a portion of this tremendous power for the benefit of mankind. See, it wasn't just ritual slaughter, it was for the benefit of the humans. It was like, if you read Fraser's The Golden Bough, you see so much of this, that it's not mindless sacrifice. It's a spiritual desire to take the power of the animals lacking in humans and bringing them into us. This is why they want you all vegans, folks. This is why they want you all eating artificial meat, because they don't want human beings to have this kind of power by consuming animal flesh. Now, they did this with specially trained male and female athletes who went into the arena, and they didn't have any weapons of any kind. and they stood before an onslaught of a bull, and the sacred performers, now they were kind of like priests, wizards, athletes, if you can imagine such a thing. They had no cape, no sword, and had nothing until the beast was upon them. Then, by grasping the horns of the charging bull, a split second before the head was lowered, they would be snapped upwards in a mighty, toss, and the athlete would be thrown up into the air, performing a somersault. Imagine what this must have looked like in those times, and landed on his feet with his back up to the bull on the ground. The feat was, as you can tell, probably deadly, and that's quite obvious. And there are numerous Cretan depictions of athletes trapped under the hooves or caught between the horns of a raging bull. Now, the aim of this was the horn grasping or horn grabbing things method ritual. This was non-lethal contact, but the touching of the horns by the athlete. So the athlete, who is a kind of a priest, magician, sportsman, runs at the bull, grabs the horns, does a somersault over the back and lands on his feet. He has stolen, in a kind of a Promethean way, the fire of the bull and brought it to the world of humans. So it's very shamanic. Very, very shamanic. So, which each grasping, every swing, every jump, the bull cult devotees believed that their champions were absorbing the energy and fertility of the bull for the benefit of all humanity. And the Cretan obsession with male virility is further evidenced by the numerous images of bulls showing an erect penis found at these locations. And a striking indication of the Cretan Minoan pride in male sexuality is the fact that all female performers in the bull ring wore a breechcloth bunched together towards the front to give the appearance of the male organ. As the spring came and the sun started warming the island, Kronos held its sacred bull ceremonies designed to sanctify the earth and its creatures with the exuberant sexuality of the bull. The spread of the bull cult from Crete was so powerful, and because remember they did it for the benefit of all mankind, not just for Minoans and Cretans, that this actual magical force spread throughout the world, and it became part of elements of religions all over the Near East and into Africa. And the Cretans used them in creating spectacular bull rituals of their own, and it spread throughout the Mediterranean world, and these practices were usually modified and adopted by them for cultural or for even, local environmental needs, and around the shores of the Mediterranean, and that's where the modern Iberian Spanish bullfighting comes from. Now, there's a very good book that I've been quoting from here, written by Jack Conrad, and it's called J.R. Conrad, The Horn and the Sword, and it came out in the 1950s, if you can find it. It might be online as a PDF. I have the original paper copy here, as you can hear, and that's where I took notes from it, and I'd pinned them on post-its on here for the show. But that's the bull cult. Now, this is something I take very seriously, not only because of being Celtic and Irish and Gaelic, whatever, the bull cult is centred to us, but I've incorporated the archetype and the mythology of the Minotaur into my own monomyth life work, creative force, and that happens, and this is everything within. The monomyth is this, the prevailing myth of the man, and then taking this into yourself. Oh, I can relate to that. Oh, I can feel that. And this has been of enormous help to me in my life. I couldn't even begin to tell you how positive incorporation of myth has been to me. And this is why I get mad at these truthers and stuff like that. Because what they're doing is, by running away from this stuff and calling it satanic and everything else, they're robbing themselves the chance to go on their hero's journey. So instead of seeing like a triangle and an all-seeing eye, and they go, satanic, foil, diamond, evil, something, satanic. If they just say, hold on a second, Why do I think that's satanic? Because I saw a YouTube channel on, Global Defeated, or, Reptilian Resistance 2012. And then if they start to explore what this thing means, it just becomes a triangle with an eye in it. And the association they've created, they've defeated. So they have defeated this demon. That was my second book, was called Defeat the Demons. The first book was Puzzling People, the Labyrinth of the Psychopath. The labyrinth, going into the labyrinth to understand, to behold the Minotaur. That was what explaining. My first book is full of mythology and folkloric stuff to describe the psychopathic element in a mythic terms, in a theological terms. I tried to, I even got to get people to reimagine the notion of Lucifer, the esoteric Lucifer, and in terms of like standing up to a psychopathic Jehovah. And then the second book, Defeat the Demons, was we've left the labyrinth and now we defeat the demons that we've come to understand what they are. So the psychopathic control grid, communism, fascism, Bolshevism, religious extremism. These are the demons. How do we defeat them? Well, we don't necessarily pick up a sword and attack them. No. We now understand that we live in a world of psychic warfare. My third book, Anvil of the Psyche, was about that. I guess all my books have followed the same trajectory. Even the ones on megaliths and even the ones, on anything, that there is a psychic world there, a psychic reality. And rather than carrying on the ignorance and the assumptions that were imposed upon you by external forces, through the approaching and engagement, I remember I used to use that word a lot, the rules of engagement. I used to use that a lot. When you understand the rules of engagement, okay, I know what you are now. Now I know what you are. I no longer have to live with the paralyzing constrictions of the mystery of what you represent. Whether you be a politician, whether you be a bully at work, whether you be a relationship with a person who's gaslighting and torturing you, I understand the rules of engagement. I'm standing in the labyrinth of the psychopath, or the labyrinth of the dysfunctional, the labyrinth of the impossible. I'm looking the Minotaur, and then I come out of the labyrinth into the daylight with the psychological, spiritual, and psychic faculties to then tackle the exterior representations in daily life of what the Minotaur. And there are times you will have to look at that Minotaur and say, that's me, in certain aspects, and you have to conquer that as well. And by God, I'm glad that I grew up with all this, and I got wise to this at a very young age, because I don't think I would have got through the lockdowns and been able to help others in overcoming we all being made political prisoners of the biotech pharmaceutical companies and bureaucracy, because it was only by understanding that we already knew about the labyrinth and the Minotaur that we could come out and we could defeat the demons. And we did defeat the demons. We really did. And I still meet people, good people from our tribes, who are still terribly damaged by the what experience they had. But at the same time too, they are still working through a process that may take a few years more to work through. And the fact that we're gaslighted from one thing into the next doesn't help them either. But then there's others who say, yeah, that's it. That's how I got through it. This is why I pulled in Lovecraftian mythology and Tolkien mythology and Irish mythology and Greek mythology and everything else during the Rona Chronicles, because it was giving us this operating software to build a strategic firewall against the pathological forces that were being put in front of us. And you know what we were doing? We were creating not only a monomyth, but a rejuvenational origin myth for those of us who were able and willing and brave enough to look the Minotaur in the eyes and then turn around and walk out of the darkness.